July 23, 1944. World War II had been going on for almost 5 years now, and by this point D-Day happened and the United States and Britain were pushing through France, while the Soviet army was pushing Germany back on the Eastern Front. After a huge Nazi retreat on the Eastern Front, the Soviet army discovered what they thought was another POW camp near Lublin, Poland. But upon closer inspection, they discovered that there were no soldiers in it. The prisoners were instead Jewish and communist men, women, and children, which the soldiers described as walking skeletons. They also discovered gas chambers, mass graves, piles of products made by and even from those people. Nothing like this had ever been seen before in history, and the world was shocked that any human, even a Nazi, could be that evil. The Allies declared this a crime against humanity, and after they won the war, they held trials to make sure the perpetrators were punished. Thus began the Nuremberg Trials. From 1945 to 1949, 185 Nazis in leadership positions that had influence over the Holocaust were put on trial for crimes against humanity. 97 were found guilty, resulting in 85 being imprisoned, 8 of which were sentenced for life, and 12 executions. However, much of the highest-ranking Nazi government, including Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, and Adolf Hitler, had committed suicide in 1945 before they could be caught, and many others tried fleeing the country, going into hiding to escape punishment. This is John Demjanjuk. He was a Ukrainian immigrant, moved to the U.S. in the 1950s, and raised a family in Ohio. He came to the U.S. with next to nothing, made a family, job, and life in a quiet town. He never broke the law, never even got a ticket, and is what many people call a perfect immigrant. So why am I telling you about a Ukrainian immigrant for my German project? Well, in 1985, the KGB from the Soviet Union opened a huge investigation of Nazi war criminals that escaped the Nuremberg Trials, especially ones that fled to America. On that list was John Demjanjuk, and he wasn't accused of being any Nazi, he was accused of being Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible was a guard outside the gas chambers at the Treblinka death camp, and is well regarded as one of the most evil Nazis in history. He was known for torturing people at the camps, is indirectly responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths, and earned his nickname due to wielding a sword to intimidate and attack the prisoners. The evidence the KGB claimed to have had was a German SS ID card, stating Ivan Demjanjuk, with Ivan the Terrible's position at Treblinka. Since he was accused of committing war crimes not in America or against Americans, the only way he could be tried was to have his citizenship stripped and sent to Israel, where he could be tried for Nazi war crimes. John defended himself, saying he was never a Nazi, and he didn't know if the picture was of him. He and many Americans claimed the USSR was doing this to create tension between West Ukrainians and Jews living in the United States, two famously anti-communist ethnic groups. And whether that was intended or not, that's exactly what happened. Large numbers of Jews and far-left groups, among others, protested the idea of the United States not deporting him to go on trial. And many East Europeans that lived under communism and moved to the US, as well as neo-Nazis and other anti-communists, protested listening to the Soviets' accusations and deporting him. They said the Soviet Union, no matter what the circumstances, cannot be trusted. A year later, in 1986, the Supreme Court deported him to go to Israel to be put on trial, where he faced the death penalty if he was found guilty. His trial began a year after that, in 1987. The trial was broadcast worldwide. John's defense initially claimed he was not a Nazi, nor was he ever at Treblinka. They claimed the ID card was of someone else, and this was a case of mistaken identity. The prosecution sent in witnesses to identify him from Treblinka. The first Holocaust survivor to speak was Epstein Pinchas, a Jew from Treblinka. He knew and saw Ivan and his atrocities at the camp, and said, "I see Ivan in front of me, just as I do every night." 6 other survivors were called on as witnesses. all 7 identified John as Ivan the Terrible. However, there were 2 problems with the testimonies. One of the survivors was named Gustav Barreau. He was born in Poland and was a young adult in the camps. He gave his testimony just as all the others did, but then the defense lawyer asked him how he got to his trial in Israel from Florida. He replied, "By train." This made the court realize they could not go entirely off of witness testimony, due to senility and dementia preventing a fully accurate recount of the events. The other issue was with the last testimony, Elihu Rosenberg. Rosenberg was part of the Treblinka uprising in 1943, in which the people in the camps revolted violently against the Nazis. He wrote a document in 1947 describing what happened during the uprising, and in one of the passages wrote specifically that they killed Ivan the Terrible in his sleep. Rosenberg was called back on trial shortly after this counter-evidence emerged. His response was, "It was my heart's wish. Of course I believed he was killed. I believed it because I needed to. In a great moment of success, I needed to know someone killed our murderer. So I told myself it happened, and I believed it with all my heart." The court responded to the skepticism of the witness testimonies by pulling up the only tangible evidence, the ID card from Treblinka that the KGB released to show the United States John was in fact a Nazi. The card had details that were specifically the same as John Demjanjuk's, including his last name, his birthplace, his father's name, a scar on his back, and an old photo of him taken in the 1940s, which John said he didn't know if was him or not. So the prosecution responded by taking a photo of John in his holding cell and tried digitally matching it with the photo on the ID card. Okay, given the technology at the time was still in its infancy, but this was the result. The 2 photos aligned almost perfectly. In response to the photos aligning, the defense tried changing its case. They now were saying John Demjanjuk was not a victim of mistaken identity, but was being framed by the KGB. They tried justifying it by saying when the Soviet army liberated the Treblinka death camp, they did seize all the Nazi ID cards there, but that included hundreds of blank ones. In John's final defense, his lawyers pointed out several minor, questionable flaws, the most significant being the fact that there were 2 staple holes on the picture on the card, but on the other side there were no staple holes at all. However, upon saying minor details that could try to prolong the case, John said, "In Ukraine we were put into stables where the doctor examined us, and there we got our blood typed." The prosecution was originally unsure why that was relevant, but realized he accidentally revealed something that the rest of the court hadn't. John was hiding a blood group tattoo. In the 1940s, only one group had tattoos of their blood type on their arms, the SS. John tried backing it up, saying they got the tattoos in case they were captured so they could pretend to be SS and escape. But ultimately, this wasn't enough counter-evidence to save John's case. On April 11, 1988, 3 years after being sent to Israel, John was found guilty and sentenced to death. But wait, this is a German project. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and with it, East Germany. The collapse of East Germany and reunification under West Germany meant the KGB files stored in the former East Berlin no longer had an owner. Tens of thousands of previously classified documents were now completely available to the public, and among those were seized records from 16 Nazis that were captured at Treblinka, stating Ivan the Terrible was a man named Ivan Marchenko, not Ivan Demjanjuk. In 1992, while John was still waiting to be executed, the ruling was overturned, and he was released. He moved back to Cleveland, Ohio for the next 17 years. And in case you thought it was over, it isn't. For the 5th time, new evidence arose. Basically, it was confirmed that John wasn't specifically Ivan the Terrible, which is what he was originally accused of and put on trial for, but he was still a Nazi from concentration camps. In 2009, John, now 88 years old, was deported to Germany to be put on trial for Nazi war crimes, not committed by Ivan the Terrible, but by Ivan Demjanjuk, which was confirmed to have been John. Demjanjuk, someone who commit war crimes in the name of the German Nazi regime, was ironically sentenced to life in prison in Munich, Germany. 3 years into his sentence, John tried to get an appeal from the court, but died at age 91. However, due to German law, if a convict dies while awaiting the process of appeal, their name is cleared, their guilt is revoked, and the status of whether or not the crime was committed by them is officially labeled as unknown. Not innocent, not guilty, unknown. The question of whether the Nazi, Soviet, or Israeli files were the true records, and whether or not John was in fact a Nazi war criminal, is still debated to this day, but according to German law, officially unknown.